She fired one bullet that morning and missed. But that satisfying miss changed everything. Grace Vance was just a small-town newspaper woman with ink-stained fingers and a broken printing press. But when a powerful mine owner sent his enforcer to silence her in a dark alley, she didn't run. She pulled the trigger. Now she's standing in the middle of Main Street, challenging a professional killer to a duel, with only 3 bullets to her name. A stranger with a haunted past and 2 holstered Colts he swore never to touch again is watching from the saloon. He knows she'll die by noon. But helping her means picking up the guns that already cost an innocent boy his life. What happens next will tear this town apart. And what she discovers hidden deep beneath the silver mine will put a target on everyone she loves. Welcome to Wild West Stories channel, where the dust never settles and every tale carries the grit of the frontier. If you love stories of gunslingers, untamed courage, and love forged under wide-open skies, you're exactly where you belong. This story reminds us that the truth doesn't need a printing press. It just needs one voice brave enough to speak it. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't standing alone. It's letting someone stand beside you. If this story stirred something in you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Would you have pulled the trigger? Share this with someone who needs a little courage today. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a story from the wild frontier.
The bullet Grace Vance fired that morning was not meant to kill anyone, but it killed everything she had ever believed about being safe in Rico. She had been awake since 4, working by lamplight in the print shop below her living quarters on Main Street. The smell of ink and machine oil hung thick in the air, and the rhythmic clank of the old hoe press filled the silence the way a heartbeat fills a chest. Her fingers were black to the second knuckle, stained with the residue of 100 words she had set by hand, letter by letter, into the iron chase. The article taking shape under her hands was about safety conditions in the Silver Bell mine. 2 men had been injured in a cave in the previous month, and Grace had interviewed the survivors from their sick beds while their wives sat beside them crying. The support timbers were rotten, the miners told her. They had complained to the foreman. The foreman told them to shut their mouths or find other work. Grace set another line of type and thought about her father. He had taught her this trade, had put her hands on the press when she was 14 and said, "This is how you hold the truth, Gracie. You set it 1 letter at a time, and you do not stop until the whole word is there for everyone to see." He had brought her to Rico 3 years ago from Missouri, convinced that a mining town needed a good newspaper the way a body needs a spine. Without it, everything just collapses. He was right. The Rico Clarion had made enemies, but it had also made changes. Crooked assayers had been run out of town. A supply merchant who was watering down flour had been exposed. The town was better for the paper and everyone knew it. Her father had died of pneumonia the previous winter. The last thing he said to her, his voice barely a whisper above the rattle in his chest, was, "Do not ever let anyone silence you, Gracie." She had not. The sun was just clearing the mountains when Grace wiped her hands on her apron and walked up Main Street to the supply store for paper stock. The air was thin and cool at 8,000 feet, and the peaks of the San Juan Mountains stood sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Rico was a rough town built on silver and stubbornness. Its wooden buildings lined up along a single muddy street like teeth in a crooked jaw. Horses stood tied to hitching posts. A dog slept in the shade of the general store porch. Somewhere a hammer rang against iron. She never made it to the supply store. Marcus Weatherby stepped out of the alley behind the assayer's office and blocked her path. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a face like something carved out of bad stone. He was the foreman at the Silver Bell mine, and he had a reputation for being quick with his fists and quicker with his gun. He had killed at least 3 men in fair fights, maybe more. The mining camps around Rico were full of men like Marcus Weatherby, men who thought the rules bent when they wanted them to. Grace tried to step around him. He moved with her, cutting off the alley. Then his hands were on her wrists, shoving her backward until her spine hit the brick wall. The smell of whiskey and sweat filled her nose. His fingers were rough and his grip was iron, and his mouth was close to her ear, his breath hot on her neck. She could feel the stubble on his jaw scraping her cheek. "Mr. Blackwell sends his regards," he whispered. Grace did not understand the words. They made no sense to her in that moment, and she filed them away in some corner of her mind without knowing she was filing away the key to everything that would come after. What she understood was the hands, the weight of him pressing her into the wall, the way his knee tried to push between hers, the low, ugly laugh in his throat when she struggled. She wrenched her right hand free. Her father's old Colt revolver was in her coat pocket. He had insisted she carry it always. "Any woman living in mining country needs to know how to protect herself," he had said. She pulled it out, thumbed back the hammer, pressed the barrel against Marcus Weatherby's chest, and pulled the trigger. The gun kicked in her hand. The bullet tore through the brim of his hat, missing his head by an inch. She had aimed for his chest. She had missed. But the sound was enormous in the narrow alley, and Marcus stumbled backward, his hands releasing her, his face gone white beneath the grime and sweat. Grace did not stay in the alley. She walked out into Main Street, into the sunlight where everyone could see. She wanted witnesses. She wanted the whole town to hear what she had to say. Marcus followed her, one hand on his ruined hat, the other hovering near his holster. A crowd was already gathering outside the saloon and the general store, drawn by the sound of the shot. Grace stood in the middle of Main Street with her father's old Colt smoking in her hand, and her voice as steady as she could make it. "You filthy piece of trash," she said. "You cornered me in that alley. You put your hands on me. You said things no decent man would say to any woman. And when I fought you off, you laughed." Marcus found his bluster. "This girl is crazy. She shot at me over nothing." "Nothing," Grace said, and her voice rose so the whole crowd could hear. "Tom Henderson was loading supplies near the general store. He heard the commotion. He saw you grab me." Tom Henderson, a weathered rancher in his 50s with sun-creased eyes and honest hands, nodded slowly. "It is true. I heard her shouting and saw Weatherby with his hands on Miss Vance. She was trying to get away from him." The crowd shifted. Men who had been uncertain now looked at Marcus with hard eyes. Women whispered behind their hands. Grace raised her chin. "I challenge you to a duel. Tomorrow at noon. Right here in this street. You will answer for what you tried to do." Marcus saw the tide turning against him. He could have backed down. He could have apologized. Instead, he smiled. It was a cold, thin smile that did not reach his eyes, and it made Grace's stomach drop. "Fine," he said. "The girl wants a duel. She will get one." As he spoke, his eyes flicked upward. Just for a moment. Just a glance toward the second-floor balcony of the Buckhorn Saloon across the street. Grace did not notice. The crowd did not notice. But up on that balcony, half hidden behind a faded curtain, a man in an expensive coat stood watching. His name was Horace Blackwell, and he owned the Silver Bell mine, and he was the reason Marcus Weatherby had put his hands on Grace Vance that morning. No one in the street below knew that yet. Grace turned and walked back to the print shop. Every eye in Rico was on her. Her legs felt like they were made of water, but she kept her back straight and her head high until she was through the door. Then she sat down hard in the wooden chair beside the press and set the revolver on the desk. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely open the ammunition box. She tilted it toward the lamplight and counted. 3 rounds. That was all. Her father had never bought more ammunition after her mother died, as if some part of him had decided he did not care about being armed in a world without her. 3 bullets for a duel against a professional killer. Grace closed the box and pressed her forehead against the cool iron of the press. She could hear the crowd dispersing outside, the murmur of voices carrying through the thin walls. Tomorrow at noon, she would have to stand in that street again, and she had 3 chances to survive. The print shop smelled like ink and iron and the ghost of her father's pipe tobacco, and Grace Vance sat alone in it and tried to figure out how to stay alive. Ryan Porter had sworn never to draw a gun again. The oath had lasted 397 days, right up until he saw the brown-haired woman standing in the middle of Main Street with a trembling Colt and enough fury in her eyes to set the whole town on fire. He was sitting in the Buckhorn Saloon at 9 in the morning working on his third whiskey. He was not proud of that. There had been a time when Ryan Porter would not have touched liquor before sundown, a time when he wore a badge and stood for something. That time was gone. Now he sat in saloons in small towns he did not intend to remember and drank until the shaking in his hands stopped, or at least slowed enough that he could hold a glass without slopping whiskey on the bar. His 2 Colt peacemakers were not on his hips. They were wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his saddlebag upstairs in the room he had rented the night before. He had not strapped them on in 397 days, and he intended to never strap them on again. That was the oath. That was the price. The price for Billy Dawes. The dream had come again last night the way it came every night. He was standing in a dusty street in Esperanza, a border town south of El Paso, where he had been sent to serve a warrant. A boy stepped out of a doorway, 16 years old, brown skin, dark eyes wide with something that might have been fear or excitement. The boy's hand went to his belt and came up with what looked like a pistol, and Ryan's body did what it had been trained to do before his mind could catch up. He drew. He fired. The boy went down. The gun that bounced in the dirt beside the boy's body was carved from mesquite wood. It was a toy. Billy Dawes was 16 years old, and he died holding a toy gun, and Ryan Porter killed him. The inquest cleared him. The judge said it was a reasonable response to a perceived threat. Ryan's fellow marshals slapped his back and told him these things happen, that you cannot hesitate in the field. But Ryan had looked at the wooden gun lying in the dust, and he had looked at the boy's face, and something inside him broke so completely that he could hear it, like a bone snapping. He turned in his badge the next day. He packed his guns in oilcloth and started drifting west, and he had not stopped drifting since. There was another wound beneath that one, older and in some ways worse. His sister Sarah, back in Texas. Her husband Emmett had beaten her for 3 years before anyone in the family knew. By the time Ryan rode to her ranch outside of Austin, Emmett had taken the sight in her right eye with the back of his hand. Ryan arrived too late. He was always arriving too late or too fast, and people got hurt either way. The gunshot from the street brought him out of the chair and through the saloon doors before he had time to think about it. He stood on the porch and watched as a young woman with dark brown hair and fire in her eyes called a man out in front of the whole town. He watched her challenge the man to a duel. He watched the man accept with a smile that meant he intended to kill her. Ryan knew that smile. He had seen it on men in a dozen cow towns and mining camps. It was the smile of a man who had done this before and enjoyed it. He recognized the man, too. Marcus Weatherby. Ryan had seen him in Leadville 2 years back, had heard the stories. 3 men killed in fair fights. Maybe 2 more in fights that were less fair. Weatherby was fast and mean, and he did not lose sleep over the people he put in the ground. This woman was going to die tomorrow at noon, and the whole town was going to watch it happen, and nobody was going to do a damn thing about it. Ryan went back inside and finished his whiskey. He ordered another. He sat at the bar and stared at the grain of the wood, and had the same argument with himself that he had been having for 397 days. "You swore," one side of him said. "You swore you would never draw again. Every time you pick up a gun, someone dies who should not." But then the other side, the side that still remembered what a badge meant, said, "And if you do nothing? If she dies tomorrow because you sat here and drank whiskey? How is that different from what happened to Sarah?" He thought about his sister's face, the scar tissue where her right eye had been. He thought about the wooden gun bouncing in the dust. 2 opposite sins pulling him in 2 directions, and either way someone got hurt. Ryan left the saloon at sundown and walked to the print shop on Main Street. He could see light through the window and a figure moving inside. He knocked. The woman who opened the door was smaller than she had looked in the street. Her eyes were hazel, sharp, and suspicious. Her fingers were stained black with ink. She held the door with one hand, and Ryan could see the other hand was behind her back, probably on the grip of that old Colt. "Miss Vance," he said. "My name is Ryan Porter. I was in town when the trouble happened this morning. May I come in and speak with you?" She studied him for a long moment. He did not blame her for the suspicion. A strange man at her door, the night before she was supposed to fight for her life. She had every reason to slam the door. She stepped back and let him in. The print shop was small and cluttered, smelling of ink and machine oil and paper. A hose cylinder press dominated the room, and boxes of lead type lined the shelves. A half-finished article sat in the chase, the letters reversed and gleaming in the lamplight. Grace Vance lived above this shop and worked in it, and it was as much a part of her as the ink on her fingers. Ryan stood with his hat in his hands and told her the truth. "Not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough. I know who Marcus Weatherby is," he said. "I have seen him work. He is a killer, Miss Vance. If you face him tomorrow, he will put you in the ground and walk away whistling." Grace's jaw tightened. "Then what do you suggest I do? Back down. Let him tell everyone I'm a liar and a coward." "I suggest you let me stand in for you," Ryan said. "I will be your second, your champion. It is an old tradition. You challenged him. I will fight him in your place." She stared at him like he had grown a second head. "Why?" she said. "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." Ryan was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. The brim was worn soft from years of handling. "I have two sisters back in Texas," he said finally. "Both of them have had to deal with men like Weatherby. Men who think women are property to be handled however they please. I was not there to help my sisters when they needed me, but I am here now, and I can help you." Grace's eyes narrowed. She was looking for the lie, the angle, the hidden cost. Ryan did not blame her for that either. "I do not need a man to save me," she said. "I am not trying to save you," Ryan said. "I am trying to save myself." He put his hat back on and walked to the door. He did not push. He did not argue. He just left the offer on the table like a card played face up, and he walked out into the night. Grace stood at the window and watched him go. She watched him walk to the livery stable where his horse was boarded. She watched him open his saddlebag and pull out something wrapped in oilcloth, something heavy that he held in both hands with a tenderness that looked almost like grief. 2 revolvers. She could see them catch the lamplight as he unwrapped them. He held them the way a man holds something dangerous, something he fears and needs in equal measure. Then he wrapped them again and put them back, and Grace Vance stood alone in her print shop with 3 bullets in an old Colt, and wondered whether the stranger was her salvation or just another kind of trouble. Grace put on her mother's blue dress that morning, not because it was pretty, but because if she had to die, she wanted to carry something of her family with her into whatever came next. The dress was old and faded at the seams, the fabric worn soft as skin from years of washing. Her mother had sewn it herself back in Missouri, in the house with the porch that faced east so you could watch the sun come up over the cornfields. Grace had been 12 when her mother died of fever, and she remembered the way her father sat in the kitchen afterward without speaking for 2 solid weeks. Just sat there, not eating, just sat there, not sleeping, not looking at anything. Grace had to feed herself, had to pump water and cook beans and pretend the world had not ended. And somewhere in those 2 weeks she made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She decided that needing people was dangerous, that love was a door you walked through and could not walk back out of, and on the other side was a silence that could swallow you whole. She braided her hair and pinned it up. She checked the Colt. 3 rounds in the cylinder, 3 empty chambers. She put the gun in her coat pocket and walked downstairs and out the front door into the morning light. Main Street was already full. It seemed like the whole town had turned out. Miners in their dungarees, shopkeepers in their aprons, ranch hands who had ridden in from the surrounding valleys to see the show. Women watched from windows and doorways, their faces tight. Children had been told to stay inside, but Grace could see small faces pressed against glass, eyes wide with the terrible excitement that comes from knowing something real and dangerous is about to happen. Marcus Weatherby stood at the far end of the street with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. He was wearing a clean shirt, as if this were a social occasion. His expression was calm, almost bored, the expression of a man who had done this enough times that it no longer made his pulse quicken. Marshal Jim Garrett stepped into the street between them. He was a thin man in his 50s with a drooping mustache and eyes that would not settle on anything for long. He looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world, and Grace could not blame him for that. Before Garrett could speak, a woman pushed through the crowd and grabbed Grace by the arm. She was tall and handsome, somewhere in her late 30s, with auburn hair piled high, and a dress that was a little too fine for a mining town at this hour of the morning. Her name was Nettie Calhoun, and she owned the Buckhorn Saloon, and she was the closest thing Grace had to a real friend in Rico. Nettie shoved something into Grace's coat pocket, a box of cartridges, heavy and cold. "I do not know if you are going to live through this," Nettie said, her voice low and fierce. "But at least do not die because you ran out of ammunition, you stubborn fool." Grace looked at her. She wanted to say something meaningful, something about friendship and gratitude and the way certain people show up in your life at exactly the right moment. But there was no time, and Grace had never been good at saying those things anyway. "Thank you," she said. Nettie squeezed her arm hard enough to hurt, then stepped back into the crowd. Marshal Garrett cleared his throat. He read the terms of the duel in a voice that cracked twice. Both parties had agreed. Both parties were armed. They would stand back to back, walk 10 paces on the count, then turn and fire. The duel would continue until one party yielded or was unable to continue. The terms were clear and legal under Colorado law. God help them all. Grace took her position in the street. The Colt felt heavy in her hand. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure Marcus could hear it from 20 feet away. The sun was climbing toward noon, blazing white in a sky that held no clouds and offered no mercy. She was about to die. She knew it with a certainty that settled in her stomach like a stone. She was about to die in the street of a mining town at the age of 22. And the last thing she would see would be the muzzle flash of Marcus Weatherby's gun. And then Ryan Porter stepped out of the crowd. He was wearing his guns. That was the first thing Grace noticed. The 2 Colt peacemakers that she had seen him unwrap the night before were now strapped to his hips in worn leather holsters, and the sight of them changed something in the air, the way the first crack of thunder changes a summer afternoon. He moved through the crowd with a walk that Grace had not seen before, something loose and balanced and predatory, and she understood for the first time that this man was not just someone who carried guns. He was someone who had been shaped by them. He did not address Marcus. He spoke to Grace, and his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. "You have every right to tell me to go to hell. But if you die today, who prints the paper next week?" It was not heroic. It was not romantic. It was the most practical thing anyone had ever said to her, and it hit her harder than any appeal to her emotions could have. Because he was right. The paper mattered. Her father's work mattered. The miners with rotten timbers over their heads mattered, and she could not help any of them if she was dead. Grace looked at the Colt in her hand. 3 bullets. She looked at Marcus Weatherby, who was watching this exchange with narrowed eyes. She looked at Ryan Porter, who stood beside her, bleeding calm from every pore, his gray eyes steady and his hands loose at his sides. She made the hardest decision of her life, not because she was weak, because she was smart enough to know the difference between courage and suicide. "All right," she said, "but I stand right here. I want to look him in the eye when he loses." Ryan nodded once. He turned to face Marcus. Marcus was not happy. "What is this?" he demanded. "I agreed to fight the girl, not some drifter." "I am Miss Vance's second," Ryan said. His voice carried in the hot, still air. "I stand in her place. If you have a problem with that, you can apologize to her right now and walk away." Marcus spat in the dirt. "I am not apologizing for a damn thing. And I am not backing down from some stranger with a fancy pair of Colts." "Then we have an understanding," Ryan said. Grace moved to the side of the street. Nettie was there and pulled her behind the water trough. Grace's hands were shaking and her mouth was dry, but she kept her eyes on the street. Ryan and Marcus stood back to back. Grace could see the tension in Ryan's shoulders, the way his fingers hung beside his holsters, loose and ready. Marcus was taller and heavier, but Ryan moved like water, everything balanced, everything controlled. Garrett began the count. His voice sounded far away, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. 1. Grace gripped the edge of the water trough. 2. She realized she was holding her breath. 3. The crowd was silent. Even the horses seemed to hold still. 4. 5. 6. Ryan took his paces steady and even, his boots raising small puffs of dust. 7. 8. Grace's knuckles went white on the rough wood. 9. She saw Ryan's whole body coil, a subtle gathering of weight and balance that happened in the space between heartbeats. 10. They spun. Marcus was fast. His hand blurred toward his holster and the gun came up smooth and sure, the motion of a man who had practiced this 1,000 times. But Ryan was faster. Not by much. A fraction of a second, a sliver of time so thin you could not have fit a playing card into it. His Colt appeared in his right hand as if it had grown there, and the shot split the air before Marcus had fully cleared leather. Marcus's revolver went spinning out of his hand. He grabbed his wrist with a howl that sounded more like rage than pain, blood streaming between his fingers. Ryan had shot him through the palm, a shot of such precision that it took Grace's breath away. But Ryan was not untouched. Grace saw him stumble, saw him press his left hand against his shoulder where a dark stain was spreading across his shirt. Marcus's shot had grazed him, a furrow across the meat of his shoulder that was bleeding freely. He had been hit. He had won the duel by a hair's breadth, and he had paid for it in blood. Ryan walked forward slowly, his Colt still trained on Marcus, who was on his knees in the dirt, cradling his destroyed hand. "It is over," Ryan said. "Do you yield?" Marcus looked up at him with an expression that Grace would remember for a long time. It was not fear, and it was not respect. It was amusement, like a man watching a joke that only he understood. "I yield," Marcus said. Then, so quietly that only Ryan could hear, he added, "You won the duel, boy, but you do not know who you are really fighting." Ryan heard it. Grace did not. She was already moving toward him, pushing through the crowd, her hands reaching for his wounded shoulder. When she touched him, her fingers came away red with his blood, and she realized it was the first time she had touched a man without being afraid. He looked at her, gray eyes foggy with pain, and tried to smile. "I think," he said, "that I need to sit down." He sat down hard in the dust, and Grace knelt beside him, and the crowd roared and cheered, and Marcus Weatherby was hauled away to the doctor's office, and for one bright, shining moment it felt like justice had been done and the world was turning the right way again. But justice is a complicated thing in a mining town, and the world does not always turn the way you expect. While the crowd celebrated, while Grace pressed her scarf against Ryan's bleeding shoulder and tried not to think about how warm his skin was under her hands, Marshal Jim Garrett slipped away from the festivities. He walked 3 blocks to the Western Union office and composed a telegram. The recipient was Horace Blackwell, currently in Denver on business. The message read, "Weatherby failed. New problem. Name Ryan Porter." Garrett paid the 2 bits for transmission and walked back to the celebration, his face carefully arranged into an expression of appropriate satisfaction. No one noticed he had been gone. No one noticed the sweat on his palms or the way his eyes kept drifting to the 2nd floor of the Buckhorn Saloon, where Horace Blackwell's empty office window looked down on the street like a dark and watchful eye. Grace Vance knew how to clean a bullet wound. Her father had taught her that much. What he had not taught her was how to keep her heart from hammering when she sat this close to the man who was bleeding because of her. The town doctor was drunk. This was not unusual. Doc Harlan had been steadily drinking himself into the ground since his wife left him for a railroad surveyor 2 years ago, and by mid-afternoon on any given day, he was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. So Grace brought Ryan to the print shop, sat him in the chair beside the press, and went to work on his shoulder with clean rags, a bottle of carbolic acid, and steady hands that she willed not to tremble. The bullet had plowed a furrow across the top of his left shoulder, deep enough to bleed heavily, but not deep enough to hit bone. She cut away his shirt with scissors, apologizing as the fabric pulled at the dried blood, and saw for the first time the landscape of his body. There were other scars. A puckered bullet wound on his left side just above the hip, a long, thin line across his ribs that might have been a knife, a burn on his forearm in the shape of a horseshoe. His skin was tanned and weathered, stretched over hard muscle, and marked with the evidence of a life that had been anything but gentle. He flinched when she touched the wound with the carbolic-soaked rag, and again when her fingers brushed the skin around it. Not from pain, or not entirely from pain. It was the flinch of a man who had not been touched with tenderness in a very long time, and who had forgotten what it felt like. Neither of them spoke for a while. The only sounds were the ticking of the clock on the shelf, the distant noise of the town returning to normal outside, and the small, wet sounds of Grace cleaning the wound. She wrapped his shoulder with a bandage torn from a clean bedsheet, tying it firmly, and when she was done, she sat back and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. It was not enough. The words were too small for what he had done, but they were all she had. "You are welcome," he said. He looked tired and pale, but his eyes were clear. The knock came an hour later. Nettie Calhoun walked in without waiting for an answer, carrying a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a look on her face that meant trouble. "I brought medicine," Nettie said, setting the bottle on the desk. "And news. Neither one is going to go down easy." She poured 3 glasses, handed one to Ryan, one to Grace, and kept one for herself. Then she leaned against the press and told them what she had heard. A miner named Duel, one of her regulars, had been drinking at the Buckhorn since the duel ended. He was loose with his tongue when he had whiskey in him, and tonight he was loose enough to let something slip. Marcus Weatherby did not jump Grace on his own initiative. Someone told him to do it. Someone paid him to put a scare into the newspaper girl. Nettie let that settle. Who? She did not know. But she had been running a saloon for 15 years, and she knew how these things worked. Men like Marcus did not think for themselves. They were hammers. Somebody else held the handle. "Watch yourself, Grace," Nettie said. "You whipped the dog, but his master's still out there." After Nettie left, Grace sat at her desk and turned the words over in her mind. Someone had hired Marcus. Someone wanted her scared. And Marcus had whispered something in the alley, something that had made no sense at the time, but now pulsed in her memory like a bruise. "Mr. Blackwell sends his regards." She did not yet know what it meant, but she knew it meant something. The next morning, Tom Henderson came to see her. The rancher looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His face was gray, and his hands would not stop moving, picking at the brim of his hat, pulling at his sleeve, touching his face as if to make sure it was still there. "I need to talk to you about my testimony," Tom said. He could not look at her. "Grace, I have a family. I have a wife and 2 boys and a ranch that is mortgaged to the hilt. And I—" He stopped. "I cannot. I'm sorry. I need to take back what I said about Weatherby." Grace felt the anger rise in her chest, hot and bright. She wanted to shout at him, to call him a coward, to ask how he could stand in front of the whole town and tell the truth one day and then crawl in here and unsay it the next. But she looked at his face and saw something that stopped the words in her throat. She saw genuine terror, not embarrassment, not shame, fear. Someone had gotten to Tom Henderson, and whoever it was had scared him badly enough to make him betray his own conscience. "Who?" Grace asked quietly. "Who threatened you?" Tom shook his head. "I cannot say. I am sorry, Grace. I truly am." He left, and Grace sat alone in the print shop and felt the walls closing in. First Marcus, then this. Someone was systematically cutting away her support, removing her allies, isolating her, and she still did not know who. 3 days after the duel, she found out. Horace Blackwell came to her office carrying a bouquet of hothouse roses that must have cost more than Grace earned in a month. He was a man in his mid-40s, immaculately dressed, with silver at his temples and a smile that could charm the bark off a tree. He was the owner of the Silver Bell Mine, the largest employer in Rico, and he was the closest thing the town had to a founding father. He had donated the money to build the schoolhouse. He sponsored the 4th of July celebration every year. He tipped his hat to every woman he passed on the street. He was, by all public appearances, the very model of a civic-minded gentleman. "Miss Vance," he said, setting the roses on her desk, "I came to offer my sincere condolences regarding the appalling behavior of my former foreman. I want you to know that Marcus Weatherby has been terminated from my employ, and I condemn his actions in the strongest possible terms." Grace looked at the roses. She looked at Blackwell. She was wary but uncertain. This was not what she had expected. "That is kind of you, Mr. Blackwell," she said carefully. Blackwell sat down across from her, uninvited, and crossed his legs. He looked around the print shop with the air of a man appraising real estate. "I have been thinking," he said. "A newspaper is an expensive enterprise, especially for a young woman operating alone. Paper, ink, maintenance on the press. It adds up. I would like to offer my financial support. A sponsorship, if you will. Enough to keep the Clarion running comfortably for the foreseeable future." Grace's instinct flared. She had been running this paper long enough to know that money always came with strings. But she was also running out of funds. Her father's savings were nearly gone, and advertising revenue had been dropping as local merchants found quiet reasons to cancel their contracts. "You need friends, Miss Vance," Blackwell said. His voice was warm and reasonable. "A smart woman knows when to accept them." Grace declined politely. Blackwell accepted the refusal with grace, but as he stood to leave, something shifted in his eyes. A hardness that appeared and disappeared so quickly she almost thought she had imagined it. Then at the door he paused. He did not turn around. "My wife died in childbirth in this town," he said. His voice was quiet, and for the first time it sounded unguarded. "That was 10 years ago. The child did not survive either. I built this mine from nothing, Miss Vance, because there was nothing else left to build." He put on his hat and walked out into the sunlight, and Grace sat in the silence he left behind and thought about the roses on her desk and the hardness in his eyes, and she was not sure what she had just seen. A generous man or a dangerous one, maybe both. That week, Ryan helped Grace deliver newspapers to the outlying ranches. Some of the town vendors had stopped carrying the Clarion, offering vague excuses about lack of shelf space or customers not wanting it. The invisible hand of someone powerful was at work, but Grace could not prove it and had no time to investigate. She needed to distribute the paper, and she could not do it alone. They rode out together on a Tuesday morning, Grace on her father's old bay mare and Ryan on the rangy dun gelding he had ridden into Rico. His shoulder was still bandaged, but healing cleanly. He rode easy in the saddle, the way a man rides who has spent more of his life on horseback than off it. They delivered papers to the Henderson Ranch, where Tom's wife Ruth accepted them with a tight smile and fearful eyes. They delivered to the Macklin place and the Swenson homestead, and the old Baylor property up near the timberline. At each stop, Grace talked to the ranchers and their wives, asked questions, wrote notes in her little leather book with a pencil stub. She was a reporter to her bones, Ryan realized. Even when she was just delivering newspapers, she was gathering stories. They made camp that night in a meadow above the tree line where the sky was so thick with stars, it looked like someone had spilled a bucket of light across black velvet. Ryan built a fire, and Grace made coffee, and they sat across the flames from each other and talked. Grace told him about Missouri, about the house with the east-facing porch, and the cornfields that turned gold in September. About her mother dying of fever when Grace was 12, and the 2 weeks her father sat silent in the kitchen, while Grace learned to take care of herself. "That was the first time I understood that loving someone could destroy you," Grace said. She was looking at the fire, not at him. The flames put gold in her hazel eyes. When you love someone and you lose them, there is a hole where they used to be, and nothing fills it. Nothing even comes close. Ryan was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled and sent sparks spiraling toward the stars. "I did something unforgivable once," he said. Grace waited. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy, like the air before a storm. He did not continue. She did not push. They sat in that heavy, honest silence until the fire burned low, and then Grace went to her bedroll and Ryan went to his, and neither of them slept for a long time. 2 days later, Ryan took a job as a security guard at the Silver Bell mine. The pay was fair and the work was straightforward, escorting payroll shipments from the bank to the mine and keeping an eye on the tunnels at night. Grace was glad he was staying in Rico. She did not examine that gladness too closely. She was not ready to. What neither Grace nor Ryan knew was that Ryan had just walked into the house of the man who was trying to destroy her. Horace Blackwell had hired Ryan Porter for a very specific reason, and it had nothing to do with payroll security. That night, Ryan lay awake in his rented room at the boarding house on 3rd Street. He opened his wallet and pulled out a piece of newspaper, yellowed and soft from handling. The headline read, "Deputy Marshal Porter cleared in shooting death of Billy Dawes, 16. He folded it carefully and tucked it under his pillow. If Grace ever saw this, she would never look at him the way she had looked at him across that campfire. And the way she had looked at him across that campfire was the only good thing left in his life. The locked room at the bottom of the Silver Bell's deepest shaft was not on any map Ryan had been given. The foreman who showed him the tunnels walked past it without a word, the way a man walks past a rattlesnake he hopes will not strike if he does not look at it. Ryan noticed it on his 3rd night patrol. A heavy timber door set into the rock at the end of a dead-end drift, 200 feet below the surface. There was light seeping through the cracks around the frame, a thin yellow line that should not have been there. Voices behind it, muffled by stone and wood, too quiet to make out words, but too loud to be imagined. He asked the night foreman, a hunched old Cornishman named Pritchard, about the door. Pritchard went pale in the lamplight. His hand tightened on the handle of his pick. "Forget about that room if you want to keep drawing pay," Pritchard said. Then he turned and walked back up the tunnel, and his lamp threw shadows that jumped and shivered on the walls like frightened animals. Ryan did not forget. He went back the following night, alone, after the shift change when the tunnels were empty. He carried his own lamp and a set of lock picks he had kept from his marshalling days. The lock was heavy but simple, a Hobbs protector that yielded to patient hands in under 3 minutes. The room beyond the door was larger than he expected. It had been carved out of the living rock, the walls rough-hewn and glistening with moisture. Wooden crates were stacked against the far wall, a dozen of them, and when Ryan pried the lid off the nearest one, the lamplight caught the contents and threw it back at him in a dull, heavy gleam. Gold ore. Raw, unrefined, still laced with quartz, but unmistakably gold. He checked the other crates, all the same. There must have been 1,000 pounds of ore in that room, maybe more. On a table in the corner, he found ledger books and a set of assayer's scales. The ledgers were detailed, written in a neat, precise hand. They documented shipments, dates, weights. Gold extracted from the Silver Bell's deepest veins and moved out of Rico on pack mules through mountain trails that bypassed every official checkpoint and assay office in the territory. The Silver Bell was officially a silver mine. That was what the claims said. That was what the taxes were paid on. That was what the investors back east believed they owned. But someone was pulling gold out of the earth and keeping it off the books. The scale of the fraud was staggering. Thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands, skimmed year after year while the investors received their modest silver dividends and never suspected a thing. And suddenly, everything made sense. This was why Horace Blackwell needed to control the newspaper. Grace's investigation into mine safety was dangerous not because it might embarrass him, but because reporters who start asking questions in one area tend to stumble into other areas. An investigation into rotten timbers could lead to questions about production figures. Questions about production figures could lead to the locked room at the bottom of the mine. Grace did not know it, but she had been digging toward the biggest secret in Rico, and Blackwell had tried to bury her before she got there. Ryan closed the ledger and set it back on the table. He had to tell Grace. He had to get this information out of the mine and into hands that could use it. He turned toward the door. Two men stood in the doorway. They were not miners. They wore town clothes and gun belts, and their faces had the flat, empty look of men who had been paid to do things that did not require a conscience. One of them was tall, with a scar that ran from his left ear to his chin. The other was short and thick, built like a barrel, with hands the size of ham hocks. The tall one spoke. "Mr. Blackwell would like you to understand that this room does not exist." Ryan did not reach for his guns. There were two of them, and the space was tight, and he knew with the cold calculation of experience that he could probably take one but not both before the second one put a bullet in him. So he stood still and let them take his Colts, and then they went to work on him. They were professionals. They hit him in the body, never the face, ribs, kidneys, stomach. They knew exactly how hard to hit to cause pain without causing permanent damage, and they knew exactly how to avoid leaving marks that would show above a collar. When they were done, Ryan was on the floor of the locked room, curled around his bruised ribs, tasting blood and listening to the sound of water dripping from the ceiling. They locked him in. He lay in the dark for a long time. The lamp had been taken, and the darkness was absolute, the kind of darkness that has weight and texture, that presses against your eyes and fills your ears with a ringing silence. He could feel the mountain above him, hundreds of feet of stone and earth, and the walls seemed to close in with every breath. He thought about Billy Dawes. He thought about Grace. He thought about whether he was willing to bleed for something again, or whether he would spend the rest of his life wrapped in oilcloth like his guns, preserved and useless. The answer, when it came, was simple. He was willing. He was... Morning came without light, but Ryan knew it was morning because the vibration of the stamp mills started up above him, a rhythmic thudding that he could feel through the floor. Then footsteps, the scrape of a key in the lock. Light. Horace Blackwell descended into the mine the way a king descends into a dungeon, with absolute confidence and a faint air of distaste. His suit was immaculate. His boots were polished. He carried a lantern in one hand and a silver-handled walking stick in the other, and his smile was firmly in place, as if this were a social call. "Mr. Porter," Blackwell said pleasantly, "I trust you slept well." Ryan got to his feet slowly. His ribs screamed. His mouth tasted like copper. Blackwell studied him with those sharp, calculating eyes. "You saw nothing down here," Blackwell said. His voice was calm and conversational, the voice of a man discussing the weather. "Because if you did, I would have to send word to certain people in Texas about where you have been hiding. I have taken the liberty of looking into your background, Mr. Porter. A former Deputy United States Marshal, quite impressive. And the business in Esperanza, well, that was unfortunate. A boy of 16, a wooden gun. The inquest cleared you, of course, but the court of public opinion can be so much harsher than a judge, do you not think?" Ryan said nothing. His hands were at his sides, and they did not shake. Blackwell leaned on his walking stick and tilted his head. "We would not want your past catching up with you," he said. "Not when you have found something worth staying for." The last sentence hit Ryan like a third fist to the gut, because Blackwell was not just threatening him. Blackwell was telling him that he knew about Grace, that he knew what Grace meant to Ryan, and that he intended to use that knowledge like a weapon. "Do we understand each other, Mr. Porter?" Ryan understood. He understood perfectly. Blackwell's men returned his Colts, unloaded, and escorted him to the mine entrance. Ryan walked out into the morning sunlight and stood blinking in the glare, his ribs throbbing, his mind racing. He looked down Main Street toward the print shop. Grace was already at work. He could see her silhouette moving behind the window, setting type, her fingers black with ink. She was doing what she always did, telling the truth one letter at a time. And she had no idea that the man who wanted to silence her had just demonstrated exactly how far he was willing to go. Something worth staying for, Blackwell had said. Ryan realized the trap. Blackwell was not just threatening him with exposure. He was going to use Ryan's secret to destroy the one thing in Ryan's life that mattered. And when the moment was right, when it would cause the maximum damage, Blackwell would play that card. Ryan stood in the sun with empty guns and aching ribs and watched Grace's silhouette move behind the glass. And he knew he should tell her everything right now, today, before Blackwell did it for him. But he thought about the way she had looked at him across the campfire, the way her fingers had been gentle on his wounded shoulder, the way she had said thank you in a voice that meant something much larger than the words. He could not bear to lose that. Not yet. It was the wrong decision, and somewhere deep down he knew it. But he made it anyway because fear makes cowards of us all. And Ryan Porter was not as brave as he wanted to be. The fire started at 3 a.m. By the time Grace woke to the sound of wood cracking, the flames had already swallowed the staircase. She had been dreaming about her father. In the dream, he was sitting at the press, setting type, and he looked up at her and said, "You smell smoke, Gracie." And then she was awake, and the dream was gone, and the air was thick and hot and orange, and she could hear the fire eating the building below her like a living thing. She rolled out of bed and hit the floor. The smoke was thinner down low, and she crawled on her belly to the top of the stairs and saw the inferno below. The entire print shop was engulfed. The press was a black shape in the center of a lake of flame, and the boxes of lead type were melting, and the papers on her desk were curling and blackening and rising into the air as ash. Her father's papers, his old editions, the records she had kept of every story the Clarion had ever printed, all of it burning. She could not get down the stairs. The fire was a wall of heat that pushed her back. She retreated to her bedroom, slammed the door, and went to the window. The street below was 20 feet down. She could jump and probably break her legs, or she could stay and burn. Then the back door of the print shop exploded inward, kicked off its hinges by a boot. Ryan came through the flames like something out of a nightmare, his coat over his head, his hands bare and blistering on the hot iron of the back stair railing. He came up the stairs by feel, because he could not see through the smoke. And he found her in the bedroom and grabbed her and carried her down through the fire and out the back door and into the alley. They collapsed in the dirt. Grace coughed until she vomited, and Ryan held his hands up in front of his face and stared at the burns that were already blistering across his palms and fingers. The back of his right hand was raw and weeping, the skin peeled away where he had gripped the burning doorframe. They sat in the alley and watched the print shop burn. The bucket brigade formed too late. By the time the townspeople got organized, the building was beyond saving. The walls caved in with a sound like a giant exhaling, and a fountain of sparks rose into the night sky and drifted over Rico like malevolent stars. Everything was gone. The press, the type, the paper stock. The article about the Silver Bell mine that Grace had been working on for 2 months. Her father's desk, her mother's blue dress, still hanging on the hook by her bed, the ammunition box with 3 bullets left on the nightstand. Number. Nettie had the bullets. Nettie had taken them after the duel and put them in her pocket. Grace remembered that, and for some reason it was the thought that broke her. She did not cry. She raged. She went to the Buckhorn at midday and pounded on the tables and shouted that she knew who had done this, that Horace Blackwell had tried to kill her, that someone in this town had to have the guts to stand up. Nettie came around the bar and wrapped her arms around Grace from behind and physically hauled her out the back door before she said something that would get a bullet in her. "Enough," Nettie said, holding Grace against the wall of the saloon. Her voice was fierce, but her arms were gentle. "You are alive. That is enough for right now. Everything else we figure out tomorrow. Today you are alive and you shut your mouth before you are not." Grace stopped fighting. She stood in Nettie's arms and breathed, and the adrenaline drained out of her and left her hollow and shaking. That afternoon, Silas Greer found her. Silas was an old miner, 70 if he was a day. with a face like a dried apple and hands that trembled from years of swinging a pick underground. He found Grace sitting on the steps behind the buckhorn, staring at nothing, and he sat down beside her with the careful movements of a man whose joints had given up on him long ago. He would not look at her. His eyes stayed on his own scarred hands, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was told to tell you something," Silas said. "If I do not, I will never work in another mine in Colorado. I am 72 years old, Miss Vance. Mining is all I know." Grace looked at him. She saw the bruise on his cheekbone, the split lip that had not quite healed. Someone had hit this old man. Someone had beaten him and sent him here with a message. "What were you told to say?" Grace asked. Silas swallowed hard. "Ask your man why Blackwell hired him. Ask him about Esperanza. Ask him about Billy Dawes." The words hung in the air between them. Grace felt something cold move through her chest, something that was not anger or fear, but a premonition of both. She found Ryan at the boarding house. His hands were bandaged, his face drawn with pain and lack of sleep. He opened the door and saw her expression and knew. He told her everything. He sat on the edge of the bed in that small, bare room, and he told her about Esperanza and the boy and the wooden gun. He told her about the inquest and the badge he turned in, and the 397 days of running. He told her about the dreams that came every night, about the face he saw when he closed his eyes. He held nothing back. When he was done, the room was very quiet. Grace stood by the door with her arms crossed over her chest, and her face was a mask that Ryan could not read. "You trusted me because I stood in front of a bullet for you," Ryan said. His voice was raw. "But the truth is, I am a killer pretending to be something better." Grace was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that cut deeper than shouting. "My father taught me one thing," she said. "The truth is the only thing worth protecting. You hid the truth from me. You let me trust you while you were carrying a secret that the man trying to destroy me already knew. You are the same as the men I have been fighting." The words were unfair. Grace knew they were unfair even as she said them. Ryan had not hidden his past out of malice. He had hidden it out of shame and fear, the same fear that drove Grace to push away everyone who tried to help her. But pain makes people cruel to the ones closest to them, and Grace was in more pain than she had been since the day her father died. "Get out," she said. "I do not want to see you." Ryan stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at her one more time, and what she saw in his eyes was not anger or argument, but a terrible, quiet acceptance, as if he had been waiting for this, as if he had always known it would end like this. He walked past her and out the door and down the stairs and into the street, and Grace stood in his empty room and listened to his footsteps fade, and she did not call him back. Nettie found her that evening sitting in the ashes of the print shop. The ruins were still warm, and the smell of charred wood and melted lead filled the air. Grace's hands were clean. For the first time in as long as she could remember, there was no ink on her fingers, and the absence felt like an amputation. "You just ran off the only person in this town willing to die for you," Nettie said. "I know," Grace said. "So what are you going to do now?" Grace looked at the ruins. The skeleton of the press rose from the ashes like an iron monument to everything she had lost. "What I always do," she said. "Handle it myself." Nettie exhaled slowly. She sat down in the ashes beside Grace, heedless of her dress. "That," Nettie said quietly, "is exactly your problem, girl." Ryan Porter rode out of Rico at first light without looking back. He was 10 miles down the mountain when he realized he was crying. It was the first time since the day he killed Billy Dawes. The tears came without warning, without buildup, the way a dam breaks. One moment he was riding through a stand of aspens with the morning sun filtering through leaves that were just beginning to turn gold, and the next moment his vision blurred and something hot was tracking down his cheeks, and his chest was heaving with sobs that sounded like they were being torn out of him by force. He let it happen. There was no one to see. Just the horse and the trees and the mountains rising around him like the walls of a cathedral, silent and indifferent to the grief of one small man on a dusty trail. He cried for Billy Dawes. He cried for his sister Sarah. He cried for Grace Vance, who had looked at him with those hazel eyes and seen something worth trusting, and who he had betrayed with his silence. He cried for himself, which was the hardest thing because Ryan Porter had spent 2 years telling himself he did not deserve to grieve for what he had lost. When it was over, he wiped his face on his sleeve and kept riding. 2 days later, he reached Telluride. Back in Rico, Grace Vance sat in the room above the Buckhorn Saloon and tried to reconstruct her life from memory. Nettie had given her the room without being asked. It was small and spare, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the rooftops of Rico toward the mountains. The noise from the saloon below came up through the floorboards, piano music and laughter, and the clink of glasses. And it should have been comforting, but it just made Grace feel more alone. She had borrowed paper and pencils from the general store, and she was rewriting the exposé from memory. Every fact, every figure, every name and date she could recall. It was painstaking work, and she knew it would not be as detailed as the original, but it was all she had. The original had burned with everything else. The problem was, even if she could reconstruct the article, she had no way to print it. The press was destroyed. The nearest printer was in Telluride, 50 miles of mountain road away. She could handwrite copies, but who would take them seriously? A newspaper had authority. A handwritten broadsheet was just a woman shouting into the wind. Horace Blackwell came to see her on the second day. He did not bring roses this time. He did not bring his smile. He walked into the Buckhorn at noon, nodded to Nettie behind the bar, and climbed the stairs to Grace's room as if he owned the building, which Grace realized with a sinking feeling he probably did. He stood in her doorway and looked at her with an expression that was no longer charming, no longer avuncular. It was the expression of a man who has stopped pretending. "I offered you friendship," he said. "I offered you money and support and a way forward. You refused. Now your press is gone. Your home is gone. The man who fought for you is gone. You have nothing left, Miss Vance, except your stubbornness, and stubbornness is a poor substitute for survival." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. Grace's hand went to her pocket, but there was nothing there. No gun, no bullets. Nettie had the bullets, and the Colt was somewhere in the ashes of the print shop. "Sell me the name," Blackwell said. "The Rico Clarion. I will buy it from you for a fair price. Enough to start over in Denver or San Francisco somewhere with theaters and restaurants and men who will not put their hands on you in alleyways. You are a talented writer, Miss Vance. Use that talent somewhere. It will not get you killed." Grace stood up from the bed. She was trembling, but not from fear. From anger so pure it felt like a flame in her chest. "No," she said. Blackwell studied her. His eyes were the color of river ice, pale and cold and absolutely still. "Pity," he said. "I do hope you reconsider before things get worse. Because they will get worse, Miss Vance, I promise you that." He left. Grace locked the door behind him and pressed her back against it and slid down to the floor and sat there with her arms wrapped around her knees, shaking. That afternoon, she learned about Tom Henderson. Nettie told her. Tom had lost his ranch. Blackwell held the mortgage, and 3 days after Tom testified on Grace's behalf at the Duel, Blackwell called in the full debt. Tom could not pay. He had until the end of the month to vacate the property his family had worked for 12 years. His wife, Ruth, was sick with grief. His boys were angry and confused. Grace sat in Nettie's room and felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like stones. Everyone who helped her was punished. Tom Henderson had stood up for her and lost his home. Ryan had fought for her and she had driven him away. Even Nettie was at risk, sheltering her in a building that Blackwell probably owned. She was not fighting one man. She was fighting a system, a web of money and fear and influence that Blackwell had spent years building, thread by careful thread, until it covered the whole town like a net. That night, alone, Grace did something she had not done since she was 12 years old. She opened the ammunition box that Nettie had kept. The old wooden box with its brass hinges and the initials S.V. carved on the lid. Samuel Vance, her father. Nettie had retrieved it from the boarding house where Ryan had been staying. The 3 bullets were not inside. Nettie had those. But the box itself was here. And Grace held it in her lap and ran her fingers over the carved initials, and the feel of the wood was the closest thing to her father's hand she would ever touch again. She opened her palm and looked at it. Clean. No ink. Her fingers were bare for the first time in years, and she did not recognize them as her own. They looked like a stranger's hands, disconnected from anything that mattered. Then Nettie came in. The saloon owner did not knock. She opened the door and walked in carrying 2 glasses of whiskey, and a look that said she had been debating whether to come upstairs for the past hour. She saw Grace sitting on the bed holding the empty ammunition box, and something in Nettie's face shifted. Not pity. Nettie did not do pity. Something harder and more useful than pity. She sat down on the bed beside Grace, close enough that their shoulders touched. She set the whiskey on the nightstand and reached into her pocket and took out the 3 bullets. She held them in her own calloused palm. "I am holding these," Nettie said. "When you need to shoot someone, I will give them back." Grace looked at the bullets. She looked at Nettie. Something broke open in her chest. Not dramatically, not with tears or shouting, but quietly, the way ice breaks on a river in the first warmth of spring. A crack, and then water moving underneath, and the knowledge that the surface will never freeze quite the same way again. She leaned into Nettie's shoulder, and Nettie put her arm around her, and they sat like that for a long time without speaking. In Telluride, 50 miles away, Ryan Porter was having the most important conversation of his life. He had ridden into town that morning, stabled his horse, and walked into the first saloon he saw with the intention of drinking until the shaking stopped. The saloon was called the Senate, and it was crowded with miners and teamsters and the usual collection of drifters and gamblers that collected in mountain towns like dust in corners. He was on his 2nd whiskey when an old man sat down across from him. The man was in his 60s, maybe older, with a face like a map of hard country. Deep lines around the eyes and mouth, a jaw set at the angle of someone who has spent a lifetime clenching it. His hands were on the table, scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who had done manual labor for decades. Ryan did not recognize him. He glanced up, then back at his drink. The old man spoke. "You are Porter, the marshal who shot my son." The words went through Ryan like a bullet. His hand dropped to his hip, but his Colts were in the saddlebag. His body tensed for a blow, a knife, a gun. Nothing came. The old man raised his hand and signaled the bartender. "2 whiskeys," he said. Then he pushed one across the table to Ryan. "My name is Josiah Dawes," the old man said. "Billy was my youngest." Ryan's mouth was dry. He could not speak. Josiah picked up his whiskey and looked at it. He did not drink. "I did not come here to kill you," Josiah said. "I thought about it. For a long time after Billy died, I thought about nothing else. I planned it out. I knew what gun I would use, and where I would find you, and how it would feel to pull the trigger. I spent 6 months in that dark place, and it nearly killed me from the inside out." He set the glass down without drinking. "But my boy drew first," Josiah said. "Even if it was a toy, even if he was playing a game that no 16-year-old should have been playing. He drew on a United States Marshal, and you had no way of knowing what was in his hand. I have spent 2 years living with that truth. It does not get easier, but it does get clearer." Ryan found his voice. It came out rough and cracked like something that had been locked in a box for too long. "So have I." Josiah looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were dark and deep-set, and there was grief in them that would never leave. But there was something else, too. Something that was not forgiveness, because forgiveness was too much to ask, but was perhaps in the same country. "Then what are you going to do with it?" Josiah said. "Drink yourself to death or do something worth a damn." Ryan stared at the old man, at the scarred hands and the grieving eyes and the whiskey he would not touch. This man had every right to put a bullet in Ryan's chest. Instead, he had ridden to Telluride and sat down across a table and given Ryan something more valuable and more painful than absolution. He had given him permission to stop running, not forgiveness. Josiah did not say he forgave him. He might never. But permission to carry the wound without letting it kill him. Permission to do something worth a damn. That evening, in the same saloon, Ryan overheard a conversation between two miners at the next table. They were talking about the Silver Bell mine in Rico, about a foreman who had been fired after a duel, about a newspaper woman who had lost her press in a fire. One of them mentioned, in the casual way that men mention things they do not think anyone is listening to, that Horace Blackwell had been moving something through the mountains at night, pack mules loaded heavy, heading toward the railroad at Durango. Gold, the other miner said. Everybody knows. Nobody talks about it. Ryan paid his tab. He walked to the livery stable. He saddled his horse. He opened the saddlebag and pulled out the two colts. He unwrapped the oilcloth and held them in the lantern light. The blued steel gleamed, and the walnut grips were worn smooth from years of use. He cleaned them carefully, loaded each cylinder with 6 rounds, and buckled the gun belt around his hips. The weight settled onto him like a second skin. For the first time in 397 days, his hands were steady. He turned his horse toward Rico and rode into the night. Grace did not believe her own eyes when Ryan Porter rode down Main Street at sundown. Not because he came back, but because this time he was wearing his guns. She was standing at the window of her room above the Buckhorn, watching the street the way she watched it every evening now, looking for threats, counting faces, trying to read the mood of a town that was slowly being strangled by a man who smiled while he squeezed. She saw the rider come in from the south, silhouetted against the red and gold sky. And she knew the shape of him before she could see his face. The set of his shoulders, the way he sat a horse, the angle of his hat. And the guns, low on his hips in worn leather holsters, catching the last of the light. He had not worn them since the day of the duel, and seeing them now changed something in the way he moved, as if a part of him that had been sleeping had woken up. Grace stood at the window and watched him ride past the Buckhorn without looking up, and she pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. And she did not know whether what she felt was relief or anger or something too complicated for either word to hold. Ryan did not come to her first. He went to Tom Henderson. The old rancher had moved out of his house and into a storage shed at the edge of town, a weathered lean-to barely big enough for a cot and a chair. His wife, Ruth, was staying with her sister in Durango with the boys. Tom had stayed behind because this was his town and he was too stubborn to leave it, even after it had taken everything from him. Ryan found him sitting on an overturned bucket outside the shed, cleaning a shotgun by lantern light. Tom looked up and regarded Ryan without surprise, as if he had been expecting him. "You came back," Tom said. "I did. She know you are here?" "Not yet." Ryan sat down on the ground across from Tom and told him everything, not just about the gold in the locked room, but about Blackwell's threats, about the fire, about the web of control that Blackwell had built around the town. He told Tom the truth about himself, about Billy Dawes and Esperanza, because he was done hiding, and because Tom deserved to know who he was allying himself with. Tom listened without interrupting. When Ryan was done, the rancher was quiet for a while, running his rag along the barrel of the shotgun in slow, deliberate strokes. "You killed a boy," Tom said finally, "and it has been eating you alive for 2 years. Yes. And now you want to come back here and fight a man who would burn a woman alive in her own house." "Yes," Tom nodded. "I lost my ranch because I told the truth about what I saw in that alley. My wife has not spoken to me in a week. My boys think I am a fool." He set down the shotgun and looked at Ryan with eyes that were tired but clear. "You know what I have left to be afraid of? Not a damn thing. What do you need me to do?" The next morning, Marshal Jim Garrett came to see Ryan. This was unexpected. Ryan had been prepared to go looking for Garrett, to make his case, to argue and persuade and probably threaten. Instead, the marshal appeared at the boarding house door at 7 in the morning, hat in his hands, looking like a man who had not slept in a month. "Can I come in?" Garrett said. "I need to talk to you." Ryan let him in. Garrett sat in the chair by the window and turned his hat around and around in his hands, a nervous habit that he seemed unaware of. "My wife is sick," Garrett said. "Consumption. The medicine costs more than I make in a year. Blackwell has been paying for it, has been for 3 years now. Every month a packet of money shows up at my door, and I take it and I use it to keep my wife alive, and I do not ask questions about what happens in the Silver Bell mine or who Blackwell's men hurt or what they do in the dark." He looked up. His eyes were red, rimmed, and glassy. "My father was a marshal," Garrett said, "in Dodge City back in the day. He was honest as the day is long. He died honest. He would not recognize what I have become." Ryan listened and said nothing. He was watching Garrett's face, looking for the lie, the angle, the performance. What he saw instead was a man at the end of his rope, a man who had sold his soul in installments and was finally facing the total. "I want to help," Garrett said. "I know I have no right to ask you to trust me. I know what I am, but I want to make this right. I want to be the man my father was, even if it is only this one time." Ryan wanted to believe him. Not because Garrett was convincing, though he was, but because Ryan needed to believe that men could change. Because if Garrett could not change, if the worst thing you did defined you forever, then Ryan was also beyond redemption, and the ride back from Telluride had been for nothing, and Josiah Dawes had wasted his terrible grace on a lost cause. "All right," Ryan said. "I will tell you what we need." That evening, Grace came downstairs to the Buckhorn and found Ryan sitting at a corner table. She stopped in the doorway. He stood up. They looked at each other across the room, and the noise of the saloon seemed to drop away, the piano and the voices and the clink of glasses fading to nothing, leaving just the two of them and the silence between them. Grace walked to the table and sat down. Ryan sat down across from her. Nettie appeared with 2 glasses and a bottle and set them on the table without a word, then went back behind the bar. It was not a romantic reunion. There were no apologies, no declarations, no tender embraces. They sat across from each other like 2 generals meeting before a battle, and they laid out their weapons on the table. Ryan told her about the gold, about the locked room, the ledgers, the pack mules running ore to the railroad at night, about Blackwell's threat in the mine, the beating, the blackmail. He told her that Blackwell had known about Billy Dawes since the day he hired Ryan, had held that information like a loaded gun, and waited for the perfect moment to fire it. Grace told him about the article she had been rewriting from memory, about Blackwell's visit to her room, his demand that she sell the paper's name, about Tom Henderson losing his ranch, and about the slow, methodical way Blackwell was cutting off every ally she had. Then they were quiet for a moment. And in that quiet, the thing that had been left unsaid pushed itself forward, demanding air. "You were right to say I hid the truth," Ryan said. "I killed a boy and I will carry that for the rest of my life. But I am done hiding. This is everything I am." Grace looked at him. The lamplight put shadows under his cheekbones and gold in his gray eyes, and she could see the cost of the past weeks written on his face, the sleeplessness and the pain, and the long ride back to a place that might not want him. "I sent you away not because you're a bad man," Grace said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I sent you away because I was afraid of needing you. Afraid that if I needed someone and lost them, like I lost my mother, like I lost my father, I would not survive it." The silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of 2 people holding back, but the silence of 2 people who have finally said the truest thing they know. From behind the bar, Nettie's voice cut through like a knife through warm butter. "Lord Almighty, would you 2 just kiss each other so we can get on with saving this town?" They did not kiss, not yet. They did not kiss. But under the table, Grace reached out and took Ryan's hand. His fingers were rough and bandaged, and hers were bare and clean, and they held onto each other with a grip that meant more than words. The plan came together quickly after that. Grace could not print the article. She had no press, no type, no way to distribute a newspaper. But Ryan had an idea. "Send it to the Denver Tribune," he said. "It is the biggest paper in the state. Blackwell cannot touch it. If the Tribune prints the story, there will be an investigation. Territorial marshals, state authorities. Blackwell will not be able to bully his way out of a story that runs on the front page in Denver." They needed someone to carry the article to Denver. It was a hard ride, 3 days through mountain passes, and whoever carried it would be a target if Blackwell found out. "I will take it," Nettie said. She had been listening from behind the bar, and she said it the way she said everything, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world and anyone who argued was a fool. "I know those mountain trails better than anyone in this saloon," Nettie said. "I have been running supplies through them for 15 years. I will take the back roads, avoid the main passes, and be in Denver before Blackwell knows the article is gone." Grace looked at her friend. "You do not have to do this," she said. Nettie gave her a look that could have stripped paint. "Do not start. I am doing this because I want to, not because you asked. The day I let Horace Blackwell decide what happens in my town is the day I close the bar and take up knitting, and I hate knitting." They spent the rest of the evening preparing. Grace copied the article in her clearest handwriting and sealed it in an envelope. Ryan mapped out the back trails and marked the places where Nettie could rest and water her horse. Tom Henderson contributed a rifle and a box of ammunition. At midnight, Nettie climbed onto the seat of a light wagon hitched to her fastest horse. She was dressed in men's clothes, a heavy coat against the mountain cold, and she had the rifle across her knees. Grace handed her the envelope. Their hands touched, and Grace held on for a moment longer than necessary. "If I am not back in 3 days," Nettie said, "something went wrong." "Nettie, hush. Do not turn it into something dramatic." The wagon rolled out of the alley behind the buckhorn and into the night. The sound of hooves on packed dirt faded, and then there was silence, and Grace stood in the dark and listened, until even the memory of the sound was gone. Ryan came and stood beside her. He did not touch her. He did not need to. His presence was enough. "Now we wait," he said. "Now we wait," Grace agreed. Horace Blackwell found out about the plan on the second day, because Marshal Jim Garrett, despite every good intention he had sworn to, was still at his core the same coward he had always been. And cowards always side with whoever they believe is winning. Garrett told himself a story as he walked to Blackwell's office above the Silver Bell Mines Company headquarters. He told himself that he was protecting his wife, that the medicine she needed cost $40 a month, and Blackwell was the only one paying for it, and if Blackwell cut off the money, Martha Garrett would die, and no principle in the world was worth his wife's life. It was a convincing story. It had the advantage of being partly true. But the deeper truth, the one Garrett could not face, was simpler and uglier. He was afraid. He had always been afraid. His father had been a brave man, and Garrett had spent his whole life pretending to be one. And the pretending had exhausted him. He told Blackwell everything. Told Blackwell the article, the Denver Tribune, Nettie on the mountain trails. He told him about Ryan's return and the alliance with Tom Henderson. He told him every detail of the plan he had been trusted with, and when he was done, he could not meet Blackwell's eyes. Blackwell listened with his hands folded on his desk and his face as still as carved stone. When Garrett finished, Blackwell nodded once. "You did the right thing, Jim," Blackwell said. "Take care of your wife." Garrett left with his pay and his shame, and Blackwell went to work. He dispatched 5 riders that afternoon, hard men on fast horses, with instructions to find Nettie Calhoun on the mountain road to Denver and take the envelope she was carrying. They were not to kill her unless it became necessary. Blackwell was not a gratuitously violent man. He preferred precision to butchery. Then he went to confront Grace and Ryan. He found them at the Buckhorn that evening, sitting at the same corner table where they had made their plans the night before. He did not come alone. He brought 2 armed men, the same professionals who had beaten Ryan in the mine, And he brought old Silas Greer. Silas looked worse than the last time Grace had seen him. His face was swollen, one eye nearly shut, and he walked with the shuffling gait of a man whose ribs had been cracked. Blackwell had brought him as a visual aid, a demonstration of what happened to people who talked out of turn. Blackwell stood at the head of their table and looked down at them with the expression of a man who has been patient long enough. "I know everything," he said. His voice was calm and pleasant, the voice of a man ordering dinner. "The article will never reach Denver. Your friend Miss Calhoun is being intercepted as we speak, and the two of you will leave Rico tonight. Or I will begin with old Tom Henderson and work my way through every person in this town who has ever smiled at you." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Ryan and saw his jaw tighten, saw his hands go flat on the table, saw the cold calculation in his eyes that meant he was measuring distances and angles and odds. "Do not," she said to him, so quietly that only he could hear. "If you draw on them, you become the killer again. And there are 3 of them." Ryan's hands stayed on the table. The muscles in his forearms were rigid, and Grace could see the effort it cost him to keep them still. Blackwell smiled. He tapped the table with one finger. "You have until midnight," he said. "After that, the consequences are yours." He left. His men left. Silas Greer stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Grace with his one open eye, and then he was gone too. The Buckhorn was quiet. The other patrons had made themselves scarce when Blackwell walked in. And now Grace and Ryan sat alone in an empty saloon and stared at each other across the wreckage of their plan. "Nettie," Grace said. "Oh, God, Nettie." "She may still be ahead of them," Ryan said. "She had a full day's head start, and she knows those trails better than anyone. And if she is not ahead of them, if they catch her, then we have to assume the article is gone," Ryan said. His voice was steady, but Grace could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. "And we have to find another way." "There is no other way," Grace said. "We have no press. We have no allies. Garrett sold us out. The whole town is terrified of Blackwell. What are we supposed to do, stand in the street and shout?" She said it in frustration, in despair. But as the words left her mouth, something shifted in her expression. Ryan watched it happen. It was like watching a lamp being lit in a dark room, the slow brightening as the wick catches, and then the steady glow. "That is exactly what we do," Grace said. She stood up. She paced the length of the bar, her mind working. Ryan watched her and waited. "I do not need a press," Grace said. "I do not need paper. I need people. Blackwell controls this town because everyone is afraid of him, because everyone thinks they are alone, because no one has ever stood up in front of everyone else and said what they all already know. If I stand in that street and say it loud enough, if enough people hear me at the same time, he cannot silence all of them. He cannot burn the truth out of 100 mouths." "It is dangerous," Ryan said. "Everything we have done since the day I shot at Marcus Weatherby has been dangerous. At least this time I get to choose the ground." Ryan looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and buckled his gun belt tighter. "When?" he said. "Midnight," Grace said. "Grace, when his deadline expires. I want him to know I'm not running." They spent the next 2 hours preparing. Grace rewrote key passages of the exposé on scraps of paper, organizing her thoughts, rehearsing the words she would say. Ryan checked his guns and loaded extra rounds. Tom Henderson arrived at the back door of the Buckhorn, having heard through the town's invisible grapevine that something was happening. He brought his shotgun and his resolve. Nettie had pressed the 3 bullets back into Grace's hand before leaving on the Denver road. Grace had them in her pocket now, along with her father's old Colt, which Nettie had retrieved from the ashes of the print shop. The cylinder was scorched and the grip was blackened, but it still worked. Grace had cleaned it and loaded it with the 3 rounds. 3 bullets. The same 3 bullets from the beginning. The same gun, the same woman, the same refusal to be silenced. At midnight, Grace walked to the Rico church and pulled the bell rope. The sound shattered the mountain silence. It rang out over the rooftops and echoed off the canyon walls, a deep bronze tone that rolled across the town like thunder. Once, twice, 3 times, 4. She kept pulling until her arms ached, and by then the streets were filling with people stumbling out of houses and hotels and boarding rooms, pulling on clothes, rubbing sleep from their eyes, asking each other what the hell was happening. Grace climbed the steps of the church and stood at the top, facing Main Street. The moon was nearly full, and it bathed the town in silver light. She could see faces below her, 100 of them, maybe more, miners and merchants and ranchers and their wives and their children. The whole town of Rico, awake and watching and waiting to hear what the woman on the church steps had to say. She took a breath. "Mr. Blackwell sends his regards," she said. Her voice carried in the cold night air, clear as the bell that had summoned them. That is what Marcus Weatherby whispered in my ear in the alley behind the assayer's office, on the morning he put his hands on me. "Mr. Blackwell sends his regards." I did not understand what it meant then. I understand now. She told them everything. She told them about Blackwell ordering the assault, about the fire that destroyed her press, about Tom Henderson losing his ranch for telling the truth, about old Silas Greer beaten and used as a weapon, about the gold hidden in the deepest shaft of the Silver Bell mine. She told them about the fraud, the stolen ore, the pack mules running through the mountains at night. She told them about the money Blackwell used to buy silence, to purchase a marshal, to control a town. She spoke for 20 minutes, and no one interrupted, and no one walked away. Blackwell arrived halfway through. He came down Main Street with his 2 men flanking him, and his face in the moonlight was a mask of cold fury. He pushed through the crowd to the foot of the church steps and looked up at Grace with eyes that could have frozen water. "That is enough," he said. His voice was tight and controlled. "This woman is a liar and a hysteric. Go back to your homes." Nobody moved. Grace kept talking. She gave them names and dates and dollar amounts. She quoted from the ledgers Ryan had seen in the locked room. She described the crates of gold ore and the assayer's scales. She gave them the truth, every piece of it laid out in the clear, precise language of a newspaper woman who knew how to build a story that could not be knocked down. Blackwell turned to his men. "Shut her up," he said. Ryan stepped out of the shadows at the base of the church steps. His hands were on his Colts, and his body had that coiled, balanced stillness that Grace had seen once before, on the morning of the duel. He stood beside her on the steps between her and Blackwell's men, and he did not say a word. He did not need to. His presence said it for him. From the crowd, a movement. Tom Henderson, old and tired and broken, stepping forward with his shotgun cradled in his arms. His voice was hoarse but steady. "I have been quiet long enough," Tom said. Then another movement, a miner named Coulter, whose brother had died in the cave in last spring. He had a pickaxe in his hands and murder in his eyes. Then a woman, Mrs. Parsons, whose husband had been cheated on his wages for 3 years. She had no weapon but her voice, and she used it. One by one they stood. Miners, merchants, ranchers, wives. People who had been afraid for years, who had swallowed their anger and kept their heads down and paid the cost of Blackwell's greed in silence. They stood up in the moonlight, and the crowd became a wall. And Blackwell's 2 hired guns looked around at a town that had finally found its spine, and they holstered their weapons and stepped back. 5 men against 100. The math was simple, even for hired killers. But Horace Blackwell was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a man who had lost his wife and child in this town and had built an empire from the ashes of that grief. And he would sooner burn than bend. His hand went to the inside of his coat, to the pocket where he kept the derringer that no one knew about. A 2-shot Remington over-under, small enough to hide in a palm, big enough to kill at close range. He pulled it out and raised it and aimed at Grace Vance, standing on the church steps with the moonlight in her hair and the truth on her lips. Ryan saw the gun. He threw himself forward, putting his body between Grace and the muzzle. He did not draw. He did not fire. He put himself in front of the bullet because that was what you did when you loved someone. You stood between them and the thing that would destroy them, and you did not count the cost. But Grace was faster. The old Colt came up from her coat pocket, the scorched grip rough in her hand, and she fired. One bullet. One of the three her father had left her. The 3 bullets that Nettie had carried and returned. The 3 bullets that had been with her since the beginning. She used one, and it was enough. The shot hit Blackwell in the right shoulder. His arm jerked and the Derringer fired wild, the bullet punching a hole in the wooden facade of the Mercantile across the street. Blackwell spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, blood welling between his fingers. Grace stood on the church steps with smoke curling from the barrel of her father's gun, and the crowd was silent, and the echo of the shot rolled away across the mountains like the last word of an argument that had finally been settled. She looked at the gun in her hand, the gun she had fired at Marcus Weatherby in the first chapter of this story, and missed. The gun she had just fired at Horace Blackwell and hit. The woman who had needed a champion had become her own. Ryan was on the ground at the base of the steps, his old shoulder wound reopened, blood soaking through his shirt. Grace dropped the Colt and ran to him. "Do not die," she said, her hands pressing against his shoulder. "You do not have permission to die." He looked up at her, gray eyes glassy with pain, and managed a smile that was more grimace than grin. "I am not planning on it," he said. "I have not kissed you properly yet." In the crowd, Marshal Jim Garrett stood motionless. He had done nothing. He had not helped Blackwell, and he had not helped Grace. He had stood frozen in the middle of the street while the world chose sides around him. And now it was over, and he was exactly what he had always been. He walked forward slowly through the silent crowd. He reached up and unpinned the badge from his shirt. He looked at it in his hand for a long moment. The tin star that his father had worn with honor, and that he had worn with shame. "I should have done this a long time ago," he said. He set the badge on the ground and walked away into the darkness. No one stopped him. No one called after him. He walked into the night and out of the story, a man who had been given every chance to be better and had failed everyone, and who would have to live with that failure for whatever remained of his life. Blackwell was disarmed and held by a dozen hands. His face was gray with pain and shock, but his eyes were still burning with the cold fury of a man who could not believe he had been beaten by a woman with a newspaper and a borrowed gun. Nettie Calhoun rode into Rico at dawn on the 3rd day, the envelope still sealed in her coat. The 5 men Blackwell sent after her had turned back during the night when word reached them on the trail that their employer was lying in the street of Rico with a bullet in his shoulder and the whole town standing over him. Nettie did not even know she had almost died. She pulled the wagon up in front of the buckhorn and climbed down with the stiffness of a woman who had been driving for 3 days straight without more than a few hours of sleep. She looked at the crowd still milling in the street, at the bloodstain on the church steps, at the broken window of the Mercantile where Blackwell's wild shot had hit, and she put her hands on her hips. "I leave for 3 days," she said to no one in particular, "and the whole town falls apart." Grace came out of the buckhorn and threw her arms around Nettie, and Nettie held her tight for a moment before pushing her away. "You smell like smoke," Nettie said, "and blood, and you look like hell." "You should see the other guy," Grace said. It was the first joke she had made in weeks, and it surprised them both into laughter. The article went to Denver that same morning. Nettie rode out again with an escort of 4 armed ranchers who volunteered without being asked. 3 days later, the Denver Tribune printed the story on the front page under the headline, "Gold Fraud Exposed in Rico Mining Operation. Owner Arrested After Town Uprising." The territorial marshal arrived in Rico within the week, accompanied by 2 deputies and a representative of the state attorney general's office. They seized the Silver Bell Mines records, opened the locked room in the deepest shaft, and found exactly what Grace's article described. Crates of gold ore, ledger books detailing years of fraud, and a scale still dusted with gold flake. Horace Blackwell was transported to Denver under guard. He faced charges in state court including fraud, arson, conspiracy to commit assault, and attempted murder. If convicted, he would serve his sentence at the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City. The trial would take months, but the evidence was overwhelming, and everyone who'd been afraid to speak before was speaking now, lining up to give testimony. Tom Henderson's ranch was saved. Grace published a public accounting of Blackwell's debt records, proving that many of the loans he had used to control people were fabricated or inflated. The community organized to challenge the fraudulent liens, and within a month, Tom was back on his property with his wife and boys, repairing fences and feeding cattle and looking 10 years younger than he had the day Grace first met him. Before Garrett left Rico for good, he found Grace on the street outside the Buckhorn. He was wearing civilian clothes, his badge gone, his horse packed for a long ride. His wife had been moved to a sanatorium in Colorado Springs where a charity fund was covering her care. Nettie had arranged it. She had not told Garrett that she was the one paying. "Your father said something to me once," Garrett said. "He told me that someday I would have to choose between money and my conscience. He was right about everything except one thing. He thought I would choose right." Grace looked at him. She wanted to be angry. She had earned the right to anger, but what she felt instead was a complicated, heavy sadness. Garrett was not a villain. He was a weak man in an impossible situation who had made the wrong choice over and over again, and the tragedy was not that he was evil, but that he was ordinary. Some people do not change, Grace thought, but that does not mean it was wrong to hope they would. Garrett rode out of Rico that afternoon, heading east toward whatever life awaited a disgraced lawman with a sick wife and an empty conscience. Grace watched him go and then turned away because there was too much to do to spend time grieving for a man who had grieved for himself enough already. Ryan was recovering in Nettie's back room, lying on the narrow bed with his shoulder freshly bandaged by the town doctor, who had been shamed into sobriety by the events of the past week. Grace sat beside him in the late morning light, and the sounds of the town came through the window, hammer blows and horse hooves and voices calling to each other. The sounds of a community knitting itself back together. "There is something I need to say," Grace said. Ryan looked at her. He was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were clear, and there was something in them that had not been there before. A stillness that was not the numb blankness of a man running from himself, but the quiet of a man who had stopped running and was standing in one place and looking at the world with open eyes. "You threw yourself in front of a gun for me," Grace said. "Again. Without even drawing your own weapon." "You shot the man who was trying to kill us," Ryan said, "without missing this time." Grace almost laughed. Almost. But there was something else pressing against the inside of her chest, something that needed to be said before she could let herself laugh again. "I will never stop carrying Billy Dawes," Ryan said quietly. "Can you live with that?" Grace reached out and took his bandaged hand. Gently, because his palms were still healing from the burns, but firmly, because she needed him to feel her there. "I will never stop being too proud to ask for help until I am backed into a corner," she said. "Can you live with that?" "I think," Ryan said, "that might be exactly why we need each other." Then she leaned forward and kissed him. It was their first real kiss, and it was nothing like the kisses in the penny novels Grace had read as a girl. It was slow and uncertain, and tasted like blood and black coffee, and the faint, lingering bitterness of carbolic acid from his bandages, his cracked lips and her chapped ones, the scratch of his stubble against her chin, the way his good hand came up and cupped her face with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. It was not perfect. It was perfect. When she pulled back, he was smiling. Not the careful, guarded smile she had seen before, but something open and undefended, a smile that showed every crack and scar and made no attempt to hide them. She realized she was smiling back the same way. That evening, in the golden hour before sunset, Grace walked alone to the ruins of the print shop. The building was a skeleton. Charred beams stood against the sky like the ribs of some great dead animal. The floor was a carpet of ash and debris, and the remains of the press rose from the center of it, a twisted mass of iron that bore no resemblance to the machine her father had taught her to love. She stood at the edge of the ruins and looked at it all. The destruction, the loss, the evidence of everything that had been taken from her. Then she saw it. A small piece of lead type, half buried in the ash near where her desk had stood. She crouched down and picked it up, wiped the soot away with her thumb. The letter V. Vance. From her father's old typesetting box, the one he had brought from Missouri, the one he had used to print the first edition of the Rico Clarion on a spring day 3 years ago. While Grace stood beside him and watched the words appear on paper like magic, she held the tiny piece of lead in her palm and closed her fingers around it. Her fingertips came away black. Ink and soot and ash and the residue of everything she had built and lost and would build again. She heard footsteps behind her. Ryan, moving carefully, his shoulders stiff but his stride steady. He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and they looked at the ruins together. "You're going to rebuild," he said. "I am going to rebuild," she said. "By yourself." Grace looked at him. At this man who had ridden into Rico, a broken drifter with his guns wrapped in oilcloth and his guilt wrapped even tighter, who had stood in a street and faced a killer for a woman he had known for one day, who had been beaten in a mine and burned in a fire and shot twice and betrayed and sent away, and who had come back. Who had come back. She smiled. It was the first smile she had worn in weeks that carried no pride, no armor, no defense. Just a woman looking at a man she had chosen, in a place she had chosen, with a life ahead of her that she was choosing to build. "No," she said, "not by myself." Ryan took her hand. His fingers were rough with calluses and tender with burns, and hers were stained black with the ink and soot of her calling. They held on to each other, and it was the simplest thing in the world, and the bravest. Behind them, somewhere down the street, a hammer was ringing. Someone had already started repairing the print shop wall, unasked, unpaid, just because it needed doing and they were there to do it. A horse whinnied at the livery. A door opened at the general store, and the bell above it chimed, and a woman's voice called out a greeting to someone passing on the street. Rico was not healed. The mine was in upheaval. The marshal was gone. The biggest employer in town was sitting in a jail cell in Denver, and the only newspaper in 50 miles was a pile of ash. It would take time. There would be hard days ahead, and setbacks, and moments when it all seemed impossible. But the town was standing, and Grace and Ryan were standing in it, together, their hands clasped, their faces turned toward the mountains where the last light of the day was painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose, and the deep, luminous purple that comes just before the stars appear. And if anyone ever asked her where it all began, Grace would say this: it began with a bullet that missed, a stranger who stayed, and the discovery that standing beside someone is not the same as standing behind them. It is the bravest thing she ever learned to do. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.